it's an unbelievable book. I
Thank you very much.
Tremendously enjoyed it. It's such a deep book and kind of a rich book. I feel like it's so chock-a-block, full of stories and side, yarns, and everywhere. And I think I heard you say once, speaking to someone else, that it started as a crime story, but it really became an American story.
Right. I didn't have time to address that, of course, in what I was talking about, but with the Jalisco boys. But I thought I was writing the great American drug trafficking book, right? Just, something about something so weird and fascinating, and I was able to get access to it too through prison, and because I knew Mexico and because I spoke Spanish and all that I thought that there probably weren't a whole lot of other reporters who could write this story, honestly. But as time went on, I began to realize that actually this was a much, much larger story. This was not a story about only a story about drug trafficking, because I had viewed it as a story at first about drug trafficking and pharmaceutical marketing, both of which were using more or less similar strategies to hawk their wares, heroin and pills. And I thought that was a mind-blowing story. I just couldn't get over that part of it. But then as I went along, the beauty of journalism is you leave your mind open. You let the facts take you where they're going to take you, and you'll come upon, you'll discover amazing things. And I love doing that. That's the beauty of the profession, I think, is to leave your mind open, let it take you, let the fact, not bring any political or prejudices to the thing. Just let it go. And as time went on, I began to realize this was a story about who we are as a people, who we are as a country. I came to believe that it was our own isolation, our own destruction of community. I believe that we have a big part of this is that we have spent 35 years at least destroying community in this country, ripping away at what brings us together. Because these are a class of drugs. This is a class of drugs that is the most isolating, seems to me. People who get addicted to them kind of turn inward and just don't hang out with anybody unless they're also people who are also using. It seems to me that it thrives also on our own isolation. That's why I used the swimming pool in Portsmouth, Ohio, as the metaphor for what happens when you ignore community, when you exalt the private sector, when you exalt individualism to such a degree that really that's all that gets any support. It's moral or financial or what have you support. And as time went on, I began to realize, dang, the heroin is the drug of the symptom of our time, the poster drug of our time, because we've spent so much time exalting the private sector, admiring wealthy people regardless of whether what they did with their money did anything good for our communities, our societies, our towns, and what have you. And meanwhile, we laugh at government. It's wasteful. It's bumbling. It's in the way. And really, the great engine of job creation is the private sector and a model of efficiency and all that. Look at this story. This story is a perfect example of the opposite. This story is how the private sector visiting a scourge unlike any other on us. And the lonely people who were fighting it all along, back when no one cared, and it happening very quietly, and they were doing so thanklessly, sometimes under threat of lawsuit, were all government employees. They were cops, they were prosecutors, they were coroners, public health, jailers, ER docs, et cetera, et cetera. And so I began to understand that there was an enormity to the story, a massive breadth to the story, and that if you were writing about heroin, you were really writing about America and who we were and who we had become.
As a physician, one of the, I thought, most poignant tales you tell is kind of how specifically the drug companies kind of got traction in these physicians' offices in the area, where these docs were helping to get people in communities where there were no jobs, there were no opportunities. Yeah. It was essentially a financial sustaining thing if you could get someone in SSI card,
Right.
right? You'd speak
By
to
that point, a lot of people had turned to disability for they had turned to disability when really their problem was economic pain, not physical pain. And they turned to disability really at first, I think, for the SSI check, the SSDI, workers' comp, whatever it happened to be. But the pills come along, and all of a sudden, the key element in that is not the check, it's the Medicaid insurance card that allows you to go to a doc, get a long prescription, and increasingly with the pill mill docs setting up, that wasn't hard to do after a while, and then going by a pharmacist and getting that prescription filled for a $3 copay. That was part of what was going on in these areas. But you know, what struck me too, I have to say, obviously this thing starts in what is Appalachia, the Rust Belt, that whole area, southern Ohio, West Virginia, parts of western Pennsylvania, southern Indiana, et cetera. That whole area, very roughly drawn, is kind of ground zero with Columbus at the top. But by the time I was onto the story, it was not just there. It was Charlotte, North Carolina, banking center, gleaming skyline, 2 pro teams, about 15 country clubs. My God, they got so many country clubs in that town. I mean, it was no longer, the economic story was no longer I could not see the economics as being why, the explanatory factor. It had to be something else. Why Portsmouth, Ohio, and why Charlotte, North Carolina? Seems to me like there was something else there. And that's where I began to fasten on the idea that this was about isolation and our own destruction of community, even in wealthy areas. These areas look great, but there's nobody out there in these, nobody walking around the streets. It's a very forbidding place where people have all the stuff. And you would think that they have then all what they need to be happy, but this is part of the story is that we as a culture began to believe that and act upon the idea that you could buy your stuff enough to make you happy. And heroin, the final expression of a product that you can buy to make you happy.
Heaven and hell, right? Same molecule.
Exactly, right,
Yeah.
and the same thing, precisely. I mean, what was amazing, what was striking to me as I got deeply into this story was that I needed to read philosophers about how we achieve happiness. That was a bizarre concept. I never had done that before, but Viktor Frankl had some fascinating things to say about meaning and finding meaning in life, and how that is really, and along the way you work towards something that you love, and along the way as a byproduct that we call happiness is created. And that meant a lot to me because that's basically the story of my life. Early on, my mom told me when I was in high school, you have to find a job that you love. Because if you don't, it's going to infect the other parts of your life, and you'll be bitter and unhappy and so on. And I never forgot that, and I spent a lot of time finding out what job I truly loved and then going after it. And along the way, I could say that I have achieved a fulfillment that I find to be overwhelming and beautiful, and that I describe as happiness. It's different. Happiness and pleasure are two different things, and what we were after is it seems to me, as a culture, pleasure, buying stuff, just buying more and more stuff. And I would see this as I would come back and go to, my mom died years ago. My dad had a lady friend, and we would go over to her house for Christmas, and big mounds of toys for the kids that they would lose interest in within, before the evening was up. So these were kind of the themes that began to suggest themselves.
I can see
far
that.
beyond drugs.
Yeah. I thought one of the darkest corners of the book, and maybe you could speak to it, is this sort of way that in some of these communities they've developed this kind of closed circuit of Walmart, shoplifting, pill mill, and $1 per milligram street value of Oxy with your SSI card,
right.
And it became this completely closed circuit economy.
Well, this is what happened to Portsmouth, Ohio. That's why I really thought Portsmouth, Ohio, for those who haven't read the book, is a town on the Ohio River, southern Ohio, was a great industrial story for a long time. It was,
Shoes, right?
I'm sorry, yeah, they made shoes. They had a busy Main Street. They had 50,000 people. It was a working class town, but people didn't feel working class. They felt middle class. And at the center of the town was this enormous football field-sized swimming pool that was called Dreamland, that was almost like the center of life, the center of civic life, community life. You could leave your kids there as babies. It was the babysitter. It was the place where you had your first kiss. The guy who owned it kept on expanding it because the money that he made, he didn't need it. Interesting idea for a CEO. I'd like to hear that a little bit more. He didn't need the money anymore because he owned a shoe factory, so he reinvested it, bought more land, and in time, the pool and the grounds just expanded, and it was this enormous center of town. Well, the town begins to fall apart, steel mill leaves, shoe factories close, half the population goes, and the swimming pool has to close in 1993. They dig it up, and it is today a massive strip mall with an O'Reilly's Auto Parts store as its anchor. And it seemed to me that this was exactly the idea of destroying community in the favor of the private something or another sector. And along the way, what happened was in Portsmouth, Ohio, it's important to this story because it was where the pill mill was invented. Doctors began to figure out this business model of prescribing scads of drugs for people for cash. And their waiting rooms were never empty then. They were just long, long lines, and so many pills were prescribed that an OxyContin, what I call an OxyContin economy, emerged in which you could buy almost anything you needed for life itself with pills. They were currency by this point. You could buy T-bone steaks, you could buy chainsaws, you could buy school clothes for your kids, whatever. And Walmart was the center of that because that's where a lot of the addicts went to steal. You could steal anything. Before on Main Street, you'd have had to go to store to store to store, and each place would be some owner there who recognized you and ready to fend you off. Now, it was Walmart with a 69-year-old greeter who would pay $9 an hour who was not going to be messing with you, right? Steal whatever you want. I'm not going to just mess, you know. And so in time, this whole OxyContin economy grew up around the destruction of what had held the town together. Jobs, people, Main Street, and I think in a kind of a more emotional or psychological way, the swimming pool. And then in a whole generation, really an entire generation or two, grew addicted to these pills. It was just an awful plague. That was very much like a plague. People describe it as you'd see one of your friends, you hadn't seen him for years, you were in high school together, hadn't seen him for years, and before he was very responsible, and all of a sudden you'd see him, and he'd be putting a touch on you, asking for money, can I come over to the house, that kind of thing. It was like all of a sudden that person was taken, and the Walking Dead, people would look like zombies walking down the Highway 52 to the Walmart. To steal something, basically, to steal. I talked to many addicts in town, or recovering, or current, actually, and they all describe outlandish schemes to steal from Walmart. Because you could, and there was no other place. It was one-stop shopping, well, it was one-stop shoplifting, too,
I think, to me, this central thing that, you've articulated it really well here, and it's so powerful in the book, this notion that these places devastated by the collapsing kind of economy of the what we call the Rust Belt, and these incredibly vulnerable people, and then you introduce this toxin of these highly addictive drugs, and then sort of predatory physicians. It's a terrible thing, but what really made people so vulnerable was this total collapse of community. And yes. This in deep kind of loneliness that the opioid epidemic kind of feeds on and contributes to and enhances. And
both,
I think,
right.
Yeah, and I think, I think that's partly what's great about this event is this feels like a community event. This feels like we're actively trying to undo this.
In county after county, I'm finding this as I travel around. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. Really gets me emotional sometimes to watch that in county after county, they are forming these groups, task forces, alliances, whatever you want to call them. Adams County was one place I was just not long ago visited, where you're bringing together these people who are different voices, right? And, recovering addicts, doctors, cops, college presidents, Kiwanis Club, Little League coach, clergy, et cetera, on and on and on. More than that, of course. And they're coming together and they're sharing, they're leveraging all those talents, all that energy, all that dynamism, those budgets, putting it all together. And of course, this sounds obvious. People come to me, and this is a very weird feeling. Sam, what's the solution? And I'm like, I'm a reporter, man. I got no idea, Seriously, that's what I tell them. But I can tell you that there is no solution. There is no solution. There's a whole bunch of small solutions, a mosaic. Think of it as that, a mosaic of solutions. All need to be tried, all need to be tinkered with, maybe improved, maybe some discarded, But the idea that this is somehow we've got some new thing we're going to invent that will solve this whole problem, that's how we got into this, right? One magic bullet, a pain pill for all pain, everybody's pain. This is how we got into this, and it would be so healthy if we never thought that way ever again, And so I think this epidemic is a golden. This is what I told some of you may have seen. In a town as surreal as Washington, D.C., the most surreal event a couple of weeks ago was me testifying in front of the U.S. Senate. I was like, it was bizarre idea. And I was like, I didn't know how to, if you look at the tape, I didn't even know how to turn on the microphone.
Yeah.
Like everyone else is like pros at this. And I'm like, hello. And it's totally dead quiet. But that's what I told him. I said, this is an opportunity. It's a gift. Obviously, it's a catastrophe. It's a lacerating torment for families all across the country, but it's also, try to think of it as a gift. You're in public service, you've been working toward, I think this is why you got into public service. It's time to, I suggested a Marshall Plan of recovery for a lot of these same communities that we're talking about, right? Yeah. American recovery instead of European recovery. I suggested, though, thinking in terms of all these different things that you in Washington will facilitate, you will not sometimes impose, but mostly leave it up to these counties that are doing this, but just help them along. Give them the funding that they need. Give it to them over the long haul, not just 1 year. That's I think is crucial. So to me, that's where I see it's a downer topic. It's a depressing thing to watch, but I think it's also a magnificent opportunity to correct some of the things and really make America great again through this.
Sam, thanks. It's awesome.
Thank you very much.